On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Chuck Frankel, your moderator for the evening, and it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Thomas Nazario is the founder and president of the Forgotten International, a nonprofit organization that does poverty alleviation work in several parts of the world. He is a California attorney, child advocate, and law professor, and his expertise in children's legal issues has led him all over the world. He has documented human rights violations involving women and children, as well as he has worked with inner city children in the Bay Area for over 30 years. He's the author of the recent book, Living on $1 a Day, The Lives Behind the Faces of the World's Poor. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to join me in welcoming Thomas Nazario.
Well, let me do two things. First of all, thank you for coming. Thank you for being interested in this subject area, as I am. And thank you for being kind, because it all looks like you're very kind people, and it's great that you are interested in this particular issue, because certainly the world needs a lot more kindness. Second, I'd like to take a second to thank the World Affairs Council. The World Affairs Council, as you may know, has been around now since 1947, and the job that it does is probably the most important job in the world, because what it does is it takes leaders from many areas of the world, brings them together and talks about the critical issues that exist on this planet. And in doing so, they bring to the forefront issues related to saving this planet, issues related to nuclear disarmament, issues related to global poverty, all of the big issues of our day. And those are the things that we need to talk about, because those are the challenges that are coming our way in the very near future. In fact, many of them have already arrived. So, but for organizations like this, we would all be traveling around in ignorance, and we can't afford to do that. So I'd like to thank them for being around all these years and for the incredible mission and job that it does. All right, putting that aside, I'd like to spend also a moment talking about this topic that I decided to talk about tonight. You know, I could have come here and talked about fairly specific little areas, issues that relate to global poverty. But instead, I figured, well, maybe since there's some diversity in this audience, maybe since people might be watching this on the web, maybe since some of those people might be young, maybe since some people might be new to this subject area, why don't I do a kind of overall overview of some of the issues that are very, very important with regards to global poverty. So that's what I thought I would do this evening and see if that works. I'm going to try to answer, I've collected about 7 or 8 questions that I came up with myself, so they're easy for me to answer since I came up with the questions. Nevertheless, I'd like to leave some time for you to ask me questions. So, and I'm coming at this as a lawyer. I'm not an economist. I'm a lawyer who has been traveling around the world for many years now for the United Nations, for Human Rights Watch, for a variety of organizations, doing reports to the UN on the treatment of children around the world based on the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I've been to a lot of countries, and I've seen a lot of poverty. And you might notice that the foreword to this book is written by the Dalai Lama. One of the people that I've met over the years is the Dalai Lama. I've known him now for about 15 years. He decided to write the foreword for our book. And it was through discussions with the Dalai Lama that I decided to change my focus from domestic rights of children in the United States to the rights of children around the world. The truth of the matter is that we only have a little bit more than 3% of the children in the world. So if we spend all of our time talking about our own kids, that really leaves the huge part of the pie not attended to. So it didn't make sense to me. Also, I care as much about a child in India as I care about a child in Indiana. So I needed to put my attention on where it was needed most, impoverished children all around the world. So it's really through my teachings at USF, my travels around the world with the State Department, my work at my own foundation, the Forgotten International, and recently written this book called Living on $1 a Day. A quick word about living on $1 a day. When we put together this book, and the book took 3.5 years for us to do, we traveled 10 countries around the world, decided which countries to go to, why we wanted to go there, what kind of stories we wanted to capture, and then got on a plane and went. The photography was done by a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer. They're absolutely great. We visited with about 50 individuals, their families, and we talked to them about, okay, how do you get through your day, through your life, with such little income, living on less than $1 a day? And we followed them we asked them questions about what are their dreams, what are their hopes for tomorrow, what are their great challenges, so on and so forth. And we got to know these people, and we brought these people to the world through this book and photographs and stories. Now, we took 15,000 photographs, and we reduced them to about 225 photographs that are, in fact, in the book. And in doing so, and writing these stories and looking at these photographs, I came away feeling that I knew most of these people. In fact, I think I know them fairly well. And it's that unique, I think, experience that I bring to talks like this. So let me spend a little time dealing with the first question I've kind of created for myself. Okay? The first question is, how do we define poverty? We throw it around a lot. What is poverty? All right, so, it turns out that if you ask different people what poverty is, they'll come up with different answers. And sometimes if you ask an economist or a sociologist or a philosopher or a statistician or a government official or a politician, they always come up with different answers. But let's just try to keep this simple. In the United States, we have what we call a poverty line. And in the United States, if you're, for example, a family of two, the poverty line is now set at $15,450. So if your family of two only makes that or less than that over the course of a year, we think of you as being impoverished. What does that mean? That means you're entitled to various kinds of governmental benefits. Okay, family four, a little bit more, $23,500. Okay, so that's the poverty line in the United States. And you don't have to necessarily be making less than that. You could be making more than that. But nevertheless, that's the starting point. It's the threshold. Now, if we take that to the World Bank came up with a different figure. And it's largely because the World Bank works in a lot of developing countries, and they know in those countries what it takes to survive and what it doesn't. And the recent figure that they've come up with is $1.25. If you're making $1.25 a day or less, you're in serious poverty. And believe it or not, there are some countries where 80% of the population make less than $1.25 a day. For those of us who work in poverty alleviation, however, we use different terms. We use a term, for example, relative poverty. What does relative poverty mean? That means that when compared to your reference group, when compared to your neighbors, when compared to people who live in your village, you are poor. So relative to them, you're poor. And that could be very poor or not so poor. It's all relative. The second term that we often use is moderate poverty. Now, moderate poverty is poverty that the World Bank also uses, and of course the United Nations also use. And people who live in moderate poverty usually make somewhere between $2 and $5 a day. And believe it or not, in some countries, that's not bad. They usually live in a dwelling which is not necessarily theirs. They could be squatting on some property that's not theirs, or they could live in a large slum somewhere. By the way, the largest slum in the world, though a lot of people think it's in India, it's actually in Mexico City. Largest slum in the world is in Mexico City. 4 million people live in that one slum alone. A lot of people think it's India because of Slumdog Millionaires. That particular slum, 1 million people live in. But a lot of people that live in moderate poverty live in those kinds of dwellings. They, however, could have access to electricity, They could even have a TV, an old broken up TV that they all sit around and watch. They live usually in one room. There's usually 8 to 10 people living in that one room. They may have enough electricity for a refrigerator. They sometimes have a fan. And that's about it. In some cases, they can put their kids to school. Sometimes not. And of course, if a medical problem may arise, they may not have enough money to deal with that. That's moderate poverty. Now, of course, what we're talking about in our book is extreme poverty. People who live in extreme poverty or less than $1 a day are in high risk of dying. They die for a variety of reasons, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But extreme poverty means that you are so poor that if something happens in your life, for example, a breadwinner may die, or a disease may come along that might take a child, or a war may break out, and you're displaced, or something even much smaller than that may happen, and all of a sudden you're at risk of dying. People who live in extreme poverty are often women and children. Sometimes they're disabled. Sometimes they're refugees or marginalized groups of one kind or another. You have to remember, of course, that in many, many countries throughout the world, there are no safety nets. And so when income is not coming in, you can't get it anywhere else. This is particularly troublesome for people who are disabled. And so they often make up a large percentage of the world's poorest people. But the biggest percentage are women and children, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But the short of it is that people that live in extreme poverty live on the edge of life and death. All right. So those are some of the terms that you probably should be, at least to some extent, aware of. The next question I kind of posed for myself is, well, how much poverty actually exists in the world? Now, let's keep this relatively simple. If you're talking about people who live on less than $1 a day, the figure is 1.2 billion people. That's 1/6 of the world's population. So 1 in every 6 people live on that income level. Now, let me make this a little simpler. We could have a breadwinner in a family making $4 a day, but he's supporting a family of 7. So when you break it down, it's still less than $1 a day. Now, if we go to the level $2 a day, 2.3 billion people live on less than $2 a day. And that's 1/3 of the world's population. So not an awful lot of money. And it's 1/3 of the world's population. So it's an enormous number of people, enormous number of people. The poorest people in the world, however, live in Central and South Africa. However, the country with the greatest number of poor people, and I suspect someone here could probably guess, is India. Now, India has anywhere from 225 million to 400 million people living on less than $1 a day or in that ballpark. So 1/3 of the world's poorest people in the world live in that country alone. At the same time, India now has quite a few new billionaires. I may have time to talk about the other side of poverty, but I may not. And if I do talk about the other side of poverty, I'd like to talk about the number of billionaires that now exist on the planet. But let's put that aside for now. By the way, why are these numbers important? And the numbers are important because poverty kills. There is no doubt that poverty kills more people on this planet than anything else. No doubt. It either kills people directly or indirectly. And in fact, on any given day, about 19,000 children die because they were too poor to live. On any given day. And the good news is that figure is actually a great improvement from what the figure used to be about 45 years ago. That's the good news. By the way, another way to illustrate this is if you live in an impoverished country in the world, your average lifespan is in the neighborhood of 39 to 43 years. If you live in a wealthy country in the world, your average lifespan is from about 77 to 81 years. And again, this is the direct and indirect result of poverty. So that's one of the reasons why these figures are so important. Not only because it's somewhat immoral to have this many people living in this kind of poverty and suffering for a good part of their lives when there is, in fact, so much wealth on this planet. But just knowing that so many people are at risk of dying young simply because they're too poor to live. All right. So that's some of the numbers. Let me talk a little bit more about what do poor people do? What do these people look like? What do they do? And I'll try to do this quickly. And of course, poor people live all over the planet, all over the planet. They live in India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China, Southeast Asia, Philippines, so on and so forth. By the way, in terms of ethnic or racial groups, Asians are the poorest people on the planet, just because of their numbers. Just because of their numbers. I mean, nearly half of the world's population lives in Southeast Asia and in India. So, putting that aside. And of course, you will find pockets of poverty in developed countries as well. You don't have to go very far. You can go outside this building, down the block and around the corner, and you'll find probably somebody, in my opinion, who's living in extreme poverty. You'll find some gentleman on the street who's been sleeping there for months. If the weather changes or if he gets a bad cold, he's either mentally disabled or just doesn't know which way to go and may die. And that's my good definition of extreme poverty. So you don't have to go very far. You don't have to go around the world. You can go around the block. So the poor of the world come in all shapes and sizes. However, we can make some generalizations about the poor. For example, if we look at the poorest people in the world, almost 60% of them are women and girls. Women and girls. And I'll talk about the why of that a little later. But another thing we can say about the world's poor, if we take 2.5 billion of them, 2.5 billion of the world's poor, 55% of them live off the land or the sea. That means that most of the poorest people in the world are subsistence farmers. That's the most common occupation that the world's poor has. Now, the life of a subsistence farmer is not easy. Not at all easy. In fact, it's extremely difficult. They live at the whim of weather, agricultural conditions, war, displacement, disease. Most are women between the ages of 20 and 35. Most make less than $1 a day. And if anything goes wrong in their life, as I said earlier, things can get really bad very quickly. Let me give you an example of this. I was in South Africa some years ago, and I was traveling from South Africa to Botswana. And in the route, we went through a village, and this village was generally made up of subsistence farmers. We came across this woman who my guide talked to me about. She had, believe it or not, several weeks ago, lost a cow. She talked about how her cow died. She said she woke up one morning, the cow was gone. She looked all over for the cow, and she found the cow out in the middle of a field, and by this time, animals had started eating her cow. Now, someone loses a cow, you don't think that's that bad. But her whole life fell apart as a result of losing that cow. That cow produced the milk that her children needed. And in fact, as a result of losing that cow, she lost her youngest infant of malnutrition, starvation. The cow also produced extra milk, which she could sell to other people in and around the village. So she lost some income. The cow also produced dung, which she could burn for fuel and keep her home warm and cook her food. That was now gone. The cow could also be used for emergencies. For example, if a child got sick, she could pay for medical bills by selling the cow. Or if the landowner wanted his property back, she could use the money by selling the cow to keep the property, because without the property to in fact, harvest her crop, there was nothing left for her. So something as simple as losing a cow spiraled downward and pretty much wiped out her family, her dreams, and everything else. That's how, again, I talk a little bit about how they live on the edge. It's that simple. We, of course, helped her, but nevertheless, there's millions that I haven't been able to help. All right, a couple of other quick things. Many, of course, who live on almost nothing live on the fish that they can catch. We have some photographs of fishermen that live in Cambodia and just live on these little boats and catch fish all day, and whatever extra fish they catch, they take to the market, they sell. 40 million people live off the waterways of the world on these little boats. And essentially, believe it or not, these 40 million people feed about 200 million people. And the same is true with subsistence farmers. These impoverished women all over the world feed over 50% of the world's population with the food that they produce. Rural poverty, of course, is much worse than urban poverty in many ways. There's a lot more of it. Some people have said, well, if we want to do something about poverty, everybody should just move to our big cities, which are now turning into mega cities and so on and so forth, but that's not going to work. The only other thing that I want to mention here is the second most common occupation that the world's poor has is recycling. Recycling all sorts of things. In many cities throughout the world, in the developing world, you don't see garbage trucks. Individuals go around and they pick up garbage, and that which is recyclable is picked up as well by impoverished people who take it to centers. 25% of all of the waste that's produced in these large cities are picked up by recyclers. And that's the way they survive. So it's the second biggest occupation that the world's poor presently do or have. Of course, the poor also work on construction. They work on many are beggars, many are herders, many work in manufacturing plants, some are miners, some are sex workers, some are sweepers. Do you know what sweepers are? They basically hire themselves out. We see a lot of them in New Delhi, hire themselves out, and they go down this road and they sweep all of the stuff off, the garbage into the street, and then eventually they burn it because no one will pick it up, so they burn it. But they keep the sidewalks clean for a lot of the merchants in and around the city, and they get very, very little for doing that. Sometimes children do it. They cut hair. They sell various kinds of products in little makeshift stores. And they also largely work in what's called the informal labor market. They kind of create their own jobs. They don't have a boss, per se. They don't get a paycheck, but you create your own jobs. And they're very, very ingenious in doing so. They'll find a need, they'll fill that need, and they'll create a job. The job could be cutting hair on a sidewalk, could be ironing clothes on a sidewalk, could be cleaning someone's ears on a sidewalk. They do all sorts of things. They have to do it to survive. All right. So that's a quick snapshot of what many of the world's poor do. By the way, a lot of people think, it's hard for me to believe, but a lot of people think that the poor are poor because they're lazy. Not true. Not true. In fact, women, I have never seen a lazy woman in all of my travels throughout the world. They're always doing something. If they're not working, they're taking care of kids. That's a job. Or they're cooking something, or they're finding firewood, or they're going out and getting water, or they're taking care of all of the other things that, in fact, they don't get paid for. One of the reasons why women are far more likely to be in poverty is they don't get paid for their work. They do twice as much unpaid work as all men do on this earth. So it's a big problem. But I've never seen a woman just sitting around doing nothing. In fact, I have made the argument that a lot of the poorest people in the world actually work harder than some of the leaders of large corporations. And they get paid 1/1,000,000th the sum. So it's of course a little crazy. All right. I'd like to talk a little bit about the unique circumstances of women and girls. As I said, 60% of the poorest people in the world are women and girls. Most work at unpaid jobs. I've talked a little bit about that already. A lot of women and girls have no ownership rights to properties. It's one of the reasons why they're so poor. They can't own property, and in fact, in many countries, if they marry someone, the property gets transferred to their husband or their husband's families. So they go through life quite impoverished throughout their entire life. In some countries, it's law. In some countries, it's custom. But nevertheless, it strips women of valuable property rights. And worse, it makes them dependent on men. Women also need flexible working hours because they often are saddled with children. And it's not a job they can get out of because in many parts of the world, men refuse to take care of children. So they have to work fewer hours, usually, again, in the informal labor market. They make less money, and again, it's another reason why they stay impoverished. They also get less education. They get less education because they're the first to be taken out of school, often by their parents, to help children at home. So that in and by themselves is also a driver of poverty. Not as many young girls graduate from elementary school and even fewer from secondary school. It's one of the reasons why my foundation likes to fund schools that only support children, or at least 50% of their student population are girls. Excuse me. The other thing that's happening here is, of course, discrimination. There's all sorts of discrimination that impacts on women. And in fact, though I don't have an awful lot of time to go through all of the crazy things, all of the terrible things that happen to women as they grow up, let me mention one, because the discrimination actually starts before they're born. And in many countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, we now have seen infanticide, the killing of little girls, and selective abortions, where individuals now use sonograms to find out the sex of their child and will abort little girls as opposed to little boys, because boys are more precious for a variety of reasons in those cultures. In fact, things have gotten so bad, and this is unbelievable, but things have gotten so bad that in Southeast Asia, because this has now been going on vis-a-vis dowries and vis-a-vis the one-child rule in China, this has been going on for some 45 years, there are now 160 missing women in Southeast Asia. 160 million missing women in Southeast Asia. So these are all women that would have been alive but for the practices of what's been going on in Southeast Asia for many, many years. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why at present there are actually more men in the world than women. A lot of people believe there are more women in the world, but there are actually more men in the world. There's 55 million more men in the world. I won't get into all of the reasons for that. Nevertheless, it is somewhat surprising to hear that, because we all know that women live longer than men, so you would naturally think that there'd be more women, but they're not. All right. I could go through some of the other terrible things that happen to women throughout their life. The book does a good job of that, and maybe you might want to pick that up. Another thing that we do in the book that's kind of interesting, on page 163 of the book, we actually did a chart on the worst places in the world to be a woman. So we picked the 10 worst countries to be a woman. We noted why it's the worst place, or one of the worst places to be a woman, and that's there for you. And of course, there have been a lot of books written on the plight of women around the world. Two of the most famous books is Half the Sky, that came out, I guess, about a year and a half ago by Christoph, the New York Times. And of course, Jimmy Carter's recent book, A Call to Action, is about the desperate state of women around the world and the reasons why that exists. So you might want to pick those books up as well and learn more about the plight of women around the world if you don't already know. All right. One of the additional reasons why my foundation spent some time funding women and children is that we've discovered, in fact, many large foundations have discovered, that if you help women and children, they are interdependent, and it's very easy. If you help a woman, you'll help a child. If you help a child, you'll help a woman. The second reason is that if you help women, either through education or through an employment opportunity or through some sort of job training program, they are far more likely to stay in school. They are far more likely to have fewer children. They are far more likely to, in fact, be able to support those children, and they are far less likely to be dependent on men as they grow older. By the way, one of the biggest drivers of poverty, at least with regards to women in the world, is domestic violence. And so freeing women from this economic dependency on men is very, very important, particularly in South America, where probably the worst kinds of domestic violence exist. All right, enough said about women. You know, I have very little time left, but let me answer one more question, and I'll do it very quickly. Why should we care? Why should we care? I mean, we all live in relatively nice homes. We're all lucky enough to live in the United States, so on and so forth. Why should we care? Well, I believe we should care for 4 reasons. One reason is that if you want to be a good person, you should care about others. It's not an accident that the Dalai Lama wrote the foreword to our book. All of the best people, all of our heroes in our history have been people who have cared for others. If you look at all of the religions, that's one of the things they preach, that you need to care for people who are less fortunate. So if you want to be a good guy, care for others. And I can go through a list of people that I think are good people, but I think you probably know who they are. The second reason is that, believe it or not, many of us have been quite lucky and quite blessed. And hence, I think we have an obligation to give back. Let me tell you a quick story. Several years ago, Bill Clinton interviewed Warren Buffett. He did a book called Giving. And he interviewed Buffett, and he said, you know, I understand you just gave away $30 billion to the Gates Foundation. Why did you do that? And he said, I've been lucky enough to be born in the right country at the right time and have made some right decisions. I have also been extraordinarily rewarded for work that I have done. However, please don't make me a hero. It's the little people who give some money, so much money that they have to deny themselves a dinner with a friend or a movie out to help another person, or the police officers of the world, or the fire people of the world, or the teachers of the world. They are our heroes. I have given away nothing that I needed. It's all surplus. I can easily live on 1% of that which I possess. So please, don't make me a hero. So I think if most of the people who have more than they need begin to look at the world that way, we'd all be in a lot better place. So that was my second reason. My third reason is that we all have an interest in helping others. In fact, if we make other people happy, they're much less likely to attack us. So if we build a content world where there's some equality, where people feel they're getting their fair share, there's going to be a lot less conflict, particularly in situations where we're going to be facing relatively soon, where there's a lack of water, a lack of food, so on and so forth. There's got to be a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources in this planet, or else we may not have a planet. So it's in our self-interest to be good to other people. If you're good to your neighbor, he's not going to steal from you. Finally, it feels good to help other people. There's a joy associated with giving. And it's a joy that I've experienced repeatedly, and it's what keeps me alive these days. I'll tell you a final story, and then I got to go. And it's a story that I like to tell because people always want to hear a Dalai Lama story. As I said, I've been a friend of his for about 15 years, and I've spent a lot of time with him, and I've learned a lot from him. So some years ago, I was with him in northern India. He lives in northern India in a town called Dharamsala. And I was staying at his quarters, and he sent one of his secretaries to get me. He said, "Go get that little professor." He calls me the little professor. And I walked into his audience room, and he let me spend the day greeting people. He actually spends a good part of his day taking audiences from people around the world who simply come and talk to him. So on this given day, a gentleman had come from Mumbai to meet with His Holiness, and he came with his entire family. And you could tell that they were quite wealthy. They were all very well dressed. They all knew English impeccably. And you could get a sense that they were wealthy. So this gentleman and his family spent about an hour speaking with His Holiness about all sorts of things, about, the mysteries of life and how to be happy and what's important here and there, and so on and so forth, all of the big questions that all of us have for the Dalai Lama, and we hope that we get a good answer, and we often do. And at the end of this meeting, the gentleman said to the Dalai Lama, "Could you do me one favor before we leave?" And I thought, okay, this is going to be easy. And the gentleman said, "Could you bless me and my family before we leave?" And I've seen the Dalai Lama bless people, so I go, okay, no problem. And the Dalai Lama surprised me, and he said, "I really don't like to bless people. It would be silly for me to bless you, because as we've just talked, I have the same problems you have, the same challenges, the same things to think about. You're just like me. I'm just like you. Hence, it would be silly. You could bless me." And then the Dalai Lama continued, and he said, "However, if you wish to feel blessed, go back to Mumbai from where you came and help all of those around you who have so little and suffer so much, and in return, you'll be blessed." And that's what I encourage all of you to do. So thanks for spending some time with me today, okay?
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas Nazario, and I hope you'll join me at the table for some questions, which we have. You have defined poverty. You've talked a little bit about the significant role of women. You've talked about reasons why those who can should help others who are less fortunate. So talk about that a little bit more. Talk about alleviation of poverty. What is going to cause the alleviation of poverty? Because you've talked about 2.3 billion people who are below $2 a day. What's going to help?
That's actually another talk that I do. It's called Out of Poverty. But nevertheless, let me give you some thoughts on it. And in the book, we talk about it as well. What are some of the things that people should consider if they wish to get into this field and actually try to alleviate poverty, either in their neighborhoods or somewhere in the world? Since we're talking about global poverty today, let me stay on that. Now, I think there are two different avenues to first think about. First of all, if you work for a large foundation, or if you're a multimillionaire or a billionaire and you want to alleviate poverty, then you might tackle macro poverty. You might actually go to a region of the world. You might work with government. You might work with a large NGO that you trust. And you might tackle poverty that way. And of course, there are a lot of do's and don'ts associated with that, but that's a totally different kind of approach, because that's serious, and it takes a lot of oversight, and there are a lot of things that could go wrong, but nevertheless, if you have those kinds of resources, that might make some sense. On the other hand, our book and our work is actually geared more to middle-class poverty alleviation. So what we're saying is you don't have to be a millionaire or a billionaire to help. You could decide to go off to a country, and instead of going off to France or Italy or Paris or whatever, go off to Bangladesh and find a little village and find a little school and decide to build a school for kids who have never had a school, and work with people there and actually find people on the ground and visit that school on occasion and do an awful lot to in fact alleviate poverty. You know, one of the best things that we can do to alleviate poverty is provide education to people who are not getting any. And that's relatively easy to do. I had a friend that I took to India once, and we went into this little shop, and he was looking for something to buy his wife. And we went into that shop several times, and it was the last day we were going to this shop. And over the course of a couple of weeks, he had noticed that a little boy was in the back of the shop, and this little boy's job was to feed the furnace coal and keep the shop warm. We were up in the hills of, foothills of the Himalayas. And the little boy was black from coal, and he slept on the floor. And all he would give this child was some candy each day. And then he said to me, "Tom, I need to do something more because I'm about to leave. Should I give him all this candy?" I said, I think we could do better than that. And at the same time, he reached into his pocket and he gave the little kid about 8 or 10 pieces of candy. And the little kid ran outside, and found all of his friends. And he gave the candy to his friends and just kept one for himself. And when my friend saw that, he said, if he could give his candy away, I could do much more. And over the course of 2 years, he built a school there. 800 children now go to that school. He's administered that school on Skype from his home in Los Angeles. And he's made a huge contribution. And let me just say one other thing. Again, you don't have to go around the block. Around the world. My wife, years ago, decided to be a big sister to a girl who had a crack mom. She was on a foster child, and she spent every other weekend with that child and made sure she had a tutor, got her through school, got her through college, paid her tuition, helped her get into law school, and that young woman is going to be a judge in a couple of months because she's just been appointed to the courts in Massachusetts. And you can do that. So poverty alleviation is something anyone can do, particularly with anyone who has at least a little bit more than what you need. I gave a talk like this once, and a woman came over and said, "I'd like to give you a check." So she wrote a check, and she showed me the check, and it was for $1,000, which I said, "Well, that's pretty nice. Thank you very much." And she said, "I would only buy another purse with that. I think you can put it to better use." And so think about that when you buy your next purse or your fancy TV or your fancy car.
With so many people out there in poverty around the world, you started an organization called the Forgotten International. And I guess the question is, can you really accomplish anything with a small organization like that, as one person beginning an organization?
About 7 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, we took a group of relatively wealthy people to India. And we called it a donor trip. And we wanted to show them extreme poverty, and we wanted to encourage them to help. And of the 6 people we took, maybe 2 or 3 helped. But one person said, "This is overwhelming, Tom. I mean, how could we do anything about this?" And I said, it's all about baby bites. Again, it could be a family that you might decide to help, or put a child through a school, or help a village. If everybody with the capacity to do something, in fact, did something and didn't use the fact that, I can't tackle the whole world as an excuse, we'd really get a lot done. So that's what my foundation does. I mean, we don't have an awful lot of money. We're still waiting for our first $1 million gift, and if we get it, that'll be great, but it hasn't happened yet. But we discovered that we can do an awful lot with actually fairly little money in some parts of the world. And I was telling you earlier, we were working with a school in India that we cut a deal with. We said, if you enroll more than 50% of girls, we'll help you. And so we asked them what they needed, and they said we needed a new classroom for our kindergarten children. So I said, okay, we'll build you a classroom. And what else do you need? They said, we haven't paid our teachers in 6 months. So we gave them $1,000, and with $1,000, they paid their teachers for 6 months. And they built a new classroom. So it doesn't take an awful lot of money in some of these countries.
But while you're doing that, isn't the growth of population outstripping you?
Well, so is the number of wealthy people that can do something. I mean, that's growing all the time as well. So I think we're actually playing catch up. The other thing that's going to happen at some point is we're going to have to put a lid on the growth of population in this world. And there might be humane ways to do that, but it has to happen. It's unsustainable.
What motivated you to write this book? You're not, in fact, describing the specific activities of your foundation. You're really just talking about poverty in general. Why?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I had done an awful lot of traveling all over the world, and I was just getting tired of seeing people who were simply forgotten. They are all over the world in much, much greater numbers than you find them in the United States. And I figured something had to be done. So we put together this organization, called it the Forgotten International. And I suspect that at least 1 billion people in the world are forgotten either by their families, by their village, by their community in one way or another, and they're lost. And I wrote the book out of compassion. I mean, I simply... I came in. I mean, if you read the book, you'll see, a lot of people have said, when you read my words in the book, they sense that it's coming from the heart. It's not coming from a lawyer. It's not coming from an academic. It's not coming from an economist. It's coming from the heart. And when we told the story of people that live on so little and often suffer so much, you'll feel that in the writing and in the photographs. And that's why we're doing it. We're trying to bring the faces of the poor to the world who can help.
What conclusion have you reached as to the role of education in alleviating poverty?
Well, I think if you make education engaging, if you make sure that, of course, girls have access to all kinds of educational opportunities, if you make education relevant to job opportunities that might exist in those countries, I think it's a great tool, in fact, to lift an awful lot of people out of poverty. I can't actually think of a better one. So investing in schools and investing in girls, probably the best technique, best strategy that's out there. One of the things we discovered in visiting schools around the world, we try to make them as sensitive as possible as to trying to keep as many girls at those schools as possible. Nevertheless, a lot of impoverished schools in the world don't have private bathroom facilities, and many of you know that. And of course, when girls get a little older, they need a little privacy. And for a lot of these schools, the bathroom is a hole in the ground behind the school. And the boys tease them, the boys harass them, and before too long, you'll notice that a third of all of the girls are dropping out of school in and around puberty because they just can't take it anymore. We have one gentleman in India who's in the parliament there. Indian members of the parliament in India get $500,000 a year to use in any manner they wish in their region of their country. And he uses $400,000 of that money to build bathrooms for little girls at these schools. So it's little things like that that can make a difference, particularly when you're dealing with education.
How much of poverty do you think, or what poverty results from repression by extremist religious groups such as the Taliban and how they treat women and girls?
It's hard to say what percentage. I mean, if you're talking about a percentage compared to all of the other causes of poverty around the world, including corruption, probably very little, because it's fairly limited to a certain part of the world. But nevertheless, anytime you're depriving children of education, you're of course increasing their chances to live in poverty and being saddled with a man who might exploit them. In that area of the world, of course, these children are sold into marriages. At any given time in the world, there are 50 million girls under the age of 18 who have been forced into a marriage. So that's another issue, of course, that deprives particularly girls of an ability to, in fact, acquire something in the way of wealth over the course of their lifetime.
How have you decided what countries to provide funds to, what kind of projects to fund in order to alleviate poverty?
You know, we target programs that are school-based, that deal with and serve unique and very, very needy populations. We also fund clinics. We also fund various kinds of training programs, computer literacy. We also fund programs that service disabled children, because in many countries, if you're disabled, that's it. You should just think about begging on the street for the rest of your life. And very, very few countries are mainstreaming disabled children, so we fund those kinds of facilities as well. As to the countries we go to, sometimes we decide on a country because of the particular issues that exist in that country. For example, we've gone into Thailand and now we're going into Cambodia because we're very concerned about the girls there that end up in the sex trade. And we're trying to fund schools that keep these girls safe and away from these kinds of predators. So sometimes it's issues, sometimes it's other kinds of things. But nevertheless, we only really go to relatively poor countries. In fact, Thailand is probably the wealthiest country we spend some time in right now.
What's your opinion about the rising inequality of wealth in the United States, and what can be done about that?
Well, you know,
I'm just going
to say a quickie on this because I know we're running out of time. But you know, if you look at the recent Forbes magazine, we now have 1,645 billionaires on this planet. 1,645 billionaires. About 30% of all the billionaires on the planet are from the United States. At the same time, we only have 6% of the population. So we have a disproportionate number of billionaires, and one of the reasons why people think the United States is one of the richest countries in the world, and it probably is. We recently heard a fairly famous NGO came out with a study on what these billionaires possess. And by the way, if we take all 16 plus 100 of them, it's something about $6.4 trillion is what they have. And that's enough to run America for about 3 years. And that's just these 1,600 people. But if we take the top 85 of them, just the top 85 richest people in the world, they control as much wealth as half of the planet. As the bottom 3.5 billion people in the world. So 85 people, or about the number of people we could easily fit in this room, control half of the wealth of the planet. At least the wealth controlled by the poorest people on the planet. 3.5 billion people. So it's that kind of disparity that's simply immoral. We don't need that kind of disparity. We don't need that kind of wealth. You know, the wealthiest individual in India just built himself a home that cost him $1 billion. And at the same time, a couple of blocks away, there's a gentleman who shines shoes on the street. And when asked, what do you do on a bad day when you don't have any customers and you don't have any money and you don't have any food? He says, I walk across the street and I eat the leaves off the tree. It's immoral.
Back to poverty alleviation, one question asks, is the answer really education? Wouldn't someone in poverty benefit more from job training in order to produce an income, and then they can be better off?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's true, particularly if you're looking at an individual who's now 14, 15, 18, 20 years old. Then maybe the best thing that you can do is give them some immediate skills, either computer skills or language skills. One of the most important skills to have in the world is the ability to speak English. So if you can provide skills very, very quickly and actually link them into employment, yeah. You know, there are probably at least a dozen different strategies you can use to lift people out of poverty. And in fact, one way to do this is to think about what keeps people in poverty and then just flip that around. These are all the things that make people poor. Okay, how do we fix that? Okay, well, flip it around. If we know that a lack of education makes people poor, then give people an education. If we know that villages that are segregated from roads, from access to trade, build them roads. Get them to where they can actually take their market or bring their goods. That will help that village. So just a variety of things that one can do. It's a list that I'll go through in a later talk, but too long to deal with today.
And now, I'm afraid, for the last question, because our time is in fact running out. In your book, Living on $1 a Day, you, in each chapter, list a number of organizations that might be able to help. There are a number of people in the audience who have asked, what can we do from San Francisco to help people who are in poverty in other parts of the world?
You know, there are a variety of things that you could do. The first thing is to not give yourself too many excuses for not doing anything. One of the things I mentioned is you could certainly travel. You can work with an organization that, in fact, works with organizations in and around the world, in a country that you might be interested in helping, in a country where you might have some roots, in a country that your grandparents came from. I don't really care. If that's too difficult, if you don't have time to do that, if you'd rather write a check, then you can write a check to an organization that you trust. You can get on their board. You can provide any kinds of free services, volunteer. There's an awful lot you can do. And again, if it's too difficult to do that, then go to a soup kitchen, give out some food every now and then, or donate food, or next time you see a homeless person on the street, stop and say hello. So it's not that difficult.
And that concludes our program for the evening. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you, the audience, to join me in thanking Professor Thomas Nazario for his outstanding talk and discussion. Thank you very much.